I want to point out something that is kind of like not discussed enough when it comes to comparing cameras. There's three things here that I want to point out that you just blaze past that really ultimately are more important than any spec sheet.
In a world where nuclear war has begun, vampires fought back in super real 3D.
The first thing that I want to point out is the spec sheet. A spec sheet is absolutely fantastic to look at. I'm not saying don't look at a spec sheet, but there's people that get hyper passionate saying that a camera is better than another camera because look, on paper it has this, and that. I get that. I listen to that. I have referenced that in comparisons to why a certain camera might be better than another camera. But there's a missing component here that is really ultimately more important that cannot actually quite be explained. The actual image quality coming out of the camera. Now, for a lot of these camera comparisons that I see done online, which I watch and value, and I'm not saying to not watch that, value it, and interpret it. But if you're a gear review channel, this is just a reality of physics. You get a camera, you have it for X amount of time, even if it's a couple of weeks, let's say, and you potentially have run it through its paces and you put it in different environments and this is what you come out with and this is what this camera can do. But the reality is that if you own a camera and you film on it regularly and you edit that footage and you work with it, you can't tell me that you're not better with that camera after a year or two of using it. There's no way that you haven't improved unless you're not using it that much. And what is the improvement? Is it that you're just better at filming? Well, that's probably a part of it, but another part of it without doubt, and I can say this as somebody that's had a lot of different cameras over the years, is that you figured out what that particular camera likes, how it behaves, where it's weak and where it's stronger. There is an undeniable mojo that sits within each sensor, and I don't think a lot of times that gets the opportunity to be tapped into and harnessed for each camera by somebody that is reviewing a camera for a week or two and having to run it through oftentimes a lot of different tests that result in chart comparisons. You can see when it starts to clip and how it handles highlights, etc. But what about if you give it exactly what it needs, what that particular camera needs, which is hard to figure out in just a week. If you give it exactly what it needs, what is the actual end image that it produces? That part is really the most important part. You can get these insane images that might just have a mojo that no other camera particularly has. Now, I'll give an example. I can't get rid of this thing because the resale value on it is dog shit. And the quality that it can produce, like if I lost all my equipment, I could still use this old ass camera and I can still produce productions right now today. And this thing's from 2014. I can produce productions today that my clients would be happy with. Now, I'm not somebody that gets hired to just film. I am somebody that makes entire videos and campaigns and films for customers. And they're not asking what camera I'm using. They just care about what the end result is. And that's a Sony FS700 in combination with an Odyssey 7Q recording unit that allows it to record in 4K with ProRes or RAW DNG. That camera is actually from 2012, I believe. I got it the year that it came out. It's been that long. Those images that I've been producing for the past decade with that camera still hold up today. They were ahead of the game for that price point at the time that that camera came out. I personally still think that those images stack up against what I'm getting with my RED and my Canons. And we're talking about a camera that ultimately on paper has less dynamic range. It's an older sensor. The color science wasn't figured out with Sony yet. Everyone at that time did not like, that was the weak point of Sony, was the color. There was too much yellow or green in the skin tones, etc. Well, not if you work it, if you know how it behaves, you could get excellent skin tones out of it. You could get excellent image quality. You could get excellent color out of it. So it's like, but you have to understand what that camera wants, and you got to spend the effort to actually color grade it. Which brings me to my next point. When it comes to comparing cameras against one another, look, I can get this camera to match this one. Like, can you get them to match? Look, you can't tell the difference. between these two cameras, they're both so capable. And oftentimes this happens potentially with a cheaper camera against a more expensive camera. You're like, you can get it to match. Well, these tests are like, yeah, you can get it to match. But that doesn't represent what the full potential is of either of those cameras, because you're kind of putting them in a state where you're trying to get them to match, which is different than trying to get the absolute best image that that camera naturally wants to produce once you start color grading it, once you start pushing curves on it, once you start pushing saturation levels. All these things start to push in a naturally different direction. Now, I've had Sonys, I have Canons, I have RED. So I've got 3 different companies. I haven't had Blackmagic. I think Blackmagic makes beautiful looking cameras. I haven't had newer Panasonics, although I started all the way back on Panasonic prosumer level camcorders. So I've been doing this a while. Once you start pushing the image with color, something naturally starts to emerge in the image. This is always changing. It goes deeper than just camera brand and a Canon look and Canon colors or RED look and RED colors, etc. and Sony and this. Everyone's got a look. And it's like, yeah, but within each of those cameras, there's a look. And you don't get to figure out what that is until you've started digging into pushing that camera's colors and then see where it wants to go. A lot of times with the color grade, I might have a general, I start as basic as this. Do I want it to be warm or cool? That's kind of my starting point. Or do I just want it to feel as natural as possible? That's about it. That's my starting point in most cases. That's me personally. Because what I like to see is, where does it start to go naturally once I start to push a little color, a little curves, a little contrast, play with the highlights a little bit, and just see what starts to happen. These cameras behave differently than one another. With my RED, I can produce, ultimately, I feel like the natural look that my particular RED Epic Dragon starts to make is, it just automatically starts leaning a little bit more filmic. It can look a little bit older, easier. It feels just naturally the way that it handles shadows. I love the way it handles shadows and darks. And you could say that's a dynamic range thing, but it's not just a dynamic range thing. It's the way that that image on the way that sensor handles the colors and the contrast and where it naturally wants to go when I start pushing it. And on the Canon, everything just feels so clean and crisp and modern and pops. And I can get both cameras to match pretty darn well. I feel like the Canon can more easily match with the RED, but I got the Sony to match with the RED just fine. You could see slight differences, but they matched pretty darn well. Again, I feel like Canon naturally matches a RED a little bit easier. But they still want to produce different images if you let them go where they want to go. And that's something that's just, that's not really discussed. You look at these like comparisons of side-by-sides of the cameras, and everybody's putting well, not everybody. I don't mean to sound like arrogant when I'm talking about this. It's important as somebody that's getting into cameras. Like, I wish it had been pointed out to me earlier. I just figured this out on my own because I don't really hear people talking about it. But when I look at a test and it's a test against the two cameras, it's always trying to get the image to a neutral state. And it's like, I get the concept of why you would do that, and it's interesting, but it does not represent what the potential is of that camera's sensor and where it wants to go in a color grade. And I've seen great images that are highly color graded when it comes to showing off like a new camera and what it can do. Those are very valuable to look at. But what happens is that people compare a lot of times when it comes to the side-by-sides, that those are the proof that one camera is better than another. And that is just kind of silly a lot of times. Yes, there are better cameras than other cameras. But in today's climate, I'm talking about an old-ass camera from 2012 still stacking up against some of the image quality. It's still keeping up with the new cameras that I have, newer cameras that I have now. So I think that there's an issue in general with the concept of doing a side-by-side comparison and walking away feeling like you know which one's better. Because inherently, you aren't really making them look as good as they can look where they naturally want to go. This is it's like a flawed test. I will still watch those tests, but I do not walk away using that as a decision maker on which camera is better. It's more important to me to find examples of DPs that are trying to get the best images that they can out of the camera. That is more important. And at that point, it really is a matter of taste a lot of times. There was a test, It was a competition done by Full-Time Filmmaker a few years ago, and it had on like, I think 6 or 7 famous YouTubers that talk about cameras. Daniel Schiffer was on there, Peter McKinnon, I think Matty Hopa was on there, if I'm saying his last name correctly, and several others. It was Canon versus Sony. They were up against each other to see if they could tell the difference between all the cameras. If they could pick between all these different shots, whether one was Sony, one was Canon, which one's Sony, which one's Canon. Interesting, fun. It's fun. It's fun. I watched it. It was fun. I played along. There were 10 shots, if I remember correctly, but it's a flawed test to start because the only goal is to get the 2 cameras to match as good as possible. And yes, you can do that. You can make different brands of cameras match. That doesn't represent what the camera actually looks like when it's given what it wants and you're making it look as good as you possibly can, or trying to get a look out of it and being sensitive to where it wants to go and playing into that. Because you can fight against the look of a camera. There's times where I filmed with the Canons and I wish that I had filmed with the RED, and vice versa. So it happens because there's a particular look that I wish I had been able to get. And now in having these cameras for years, I know much better. I'm much more consistent in picking the right camera for the right type of shot that I'm going, based on how I've lit it and how much light's going into it and all that kind of stuff. But back to this comparison. Peter McKinnon won. I'm just going to cut to the chase. He won. He guessed 7 out of the 10. Now, I'm not here to toot my own horn. I played along. Personally, I guessed 9 out of the 10. So I actually would have won that competition. But the reason that I already knew how to tell what the difference was between Canon and Sony, because I've had both cameras. I think Peter's never had Sony, so that might be part of it right there. And one of the things that I know about the Sony is that I always felt this. And even when I had Sony, the reason I switched to Canon was because of exactly this. Ultimately, unless you're filming in RAW DNG on the Sony cameras, it always looks more compressed. It's subtle. It's always flatter. It's always a little bit more neutral. The Canons naturally pop a little bit more. They got a little bit more saturation to them. And in my opinion, they naturally make people's skin look a little bit more vibrant and healthy. It's not just saturation. You could say it's colors. There's something else there. I think that Sony's inherently, it's just my opinion, are sharper, and the Canon is just a little bit softer. If you use a RED camera, which is considered an actual true film camera used on theatrical release films, it's softer than both of them. There's something to having a softer image to work with and then adding sharpness in post that comes out better. And a little bit of softness is actually super important in making people look good. There's a recent video with Gerald Undone where he just did a review on the A7 IV, which I'm not super familiar with that camera, and I watched most of that review. And I'm not buying cameras right now, so I'm not going into extreme depth on that. But randomly, he brought up, because he had recently done a Canon R6 review, which is another new camera coming out. R6 III, I think it is. Again, I'm not buying cameras right now, so I'm not familiar on every single feature, but this is just a base point to understand that. And he brought up the Canon R6 side by side with the A7 V. He wasn't even really doing a comparison. I forget why he brought it up as a way of advertising his LUT packs. So he wasn't even trying, he was just advertising that he has LUT packs for both Canon and Sony and that they're extremely accurate. And they just bring you to a neutral point, which is great. That's fine. And Gerald Undone makes the best, in my opinion, the best breakdowns of the chart videos. And I do find those valuable, and I use clips of those in my videos to demonstrate spec things. But this is a different conversation. This is about what does the actual image look like. And immediately when I saw the side-by-side, you can just tell, and I'll cue it up right here. Look at it. Really look at it. The Sony is just a little bit flatter naturally. There is just a little bit more natural punch in the Canon. It just has that natural look. Now, you may prefer the flatter, slightly more compressed look. You may not call it compressed. For you, aesthetically, maybe that just feels, I don't know, less digital, maybe. I don't know. I'm trying to help you out here. I'm trying to steel man you, but I can't quite do it. Sony's amazing. I think Sony RAW is amazing. I think that Canon has just been ahead in offering more RAW options in their cameras for a few years now, which is why I think it's hilarious that there's this, when the C50 was announced, that it was the FX3 killer. And I'm just like, why? exactly is it the FX3 killer when the R5C already came out and offered 8K RAW while the while the FX3 is still a compressed 4K codec, and you can just see it. You just look at it. You can see that it's more compressed. Anyway, that's me, blah, 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 blah. I know I pissed off a lot of people just right then, but I doubt many Sony shooters have watched all the way to here. So, and I still like Sony cameras. I told you, I can't sell this thing. I could still run my whole business with this Sony camera. They produce amazing images, but undeniably, there's a reason that I have gone with Canon a little bit more. If you really, really start looking at what I'm pointing at, I think you'll start seeing it. That pretty much kind of seals it up. I think I said I had 3 points. I think that was mixed into that rant. Somewhere we could identify that there were 3 big points. But just to summarize again, don't just look at charts. Think about the actual end image. Look, I would personally, and I do, reference more the best shooters shooting with the best lighting and trying to get the camera to look as good as it possibly can. But do keep in mind that it is different having the camera for a long time and figuring out what it does and doesn't like. And you get better and better with your camera. So it's like it's really healthy that if you're looking, do not just shop in the new market. You can look at these used markets, or you can look at cameras that have been out for a few years, and people have gotten better and better with those cameras, and they're still continuing to put out these, great productions, and you can see how these things are looking as somebody's evolved with getting better with the camera. And then the other thing being that there is a natural look that starts to happen whenever you start pushing a sensor and being sensitive to that while you're color grading and seeing where it wants to go rather than being dead set determined on just getting it as neutral as possible. I mean, nobody really does that. You might have a dead set idea that you want to have a certain look, and you can go for that and you can get there, or you can get as close as that camera can get to it. And then you can realize if it can or cannot do it, or you should have shot it differently based on, a lot of times so much of this is just exposure. Where you set the exposure greatly affects how the image ends up coming out, because it's not just about achieving, what's good on your waveform monitor either. Like, that's going to be a different look if you overly light something or give it too much light. Like, it's good to give a camera sensor as much light as it needs, maybe a little bit more, but it's a different look. It starts lighting the environment differently, and the cameras handle the highlights and the shadows differently. There's so much experimentation that happens with your camera when you own it and you work with it for a few years in all these different situations. It's so different than having it for a week or two and trying to run as many tests as you can on it to put out a video that, again, that's all we got to go with, and we get excited about these new cameras. And I bought my Canon R5C based on exactly that. I bought my Canon R5C within 2 or 3 months of it, I believe, coming out publicly. And it was based on, get the kind of images that they were getting out of it. But I will be honest, at that time, there was the majority of the images that were coming out for the Canon R5C still felt too digitally for me. And I looked at a couple that weren't, and I thought, okay, I think I can grade it to get to look like that. Like, I think that it can go even more in that direction if I wanted to try and make it go in that direction for what I personally wanted. I'm like, I think that camera is capable of doing that. I'm going to get that camera and we'll see. And I was right. It really did as I started to push. In fact, it was better than I thought. And that's why I ended up buying a second Canon R5C. All right. We have talked about enough today. I hope that you found that valuable. If you did, throw a like on there. You can subscribe and follow along. I don't really like asking for that kind of thing, but I'm just reminding you that it does help the channel, my small channel that's trying to grow, and I love having the excuse and reason to make more of these videos. The more you guys that are watching it, the more reason I have to pull myself away from paid work and start making more videos, because I like making these. These are fun. I like talking about it. I hope I didn't offend you, especially if you're a Sony user. And again, if you misconstrue what I'm saying and that I don't think charts are important, you have misconstrued me. I am not saying that. You got to factor in all the things I'm saying. At the end of the day, the most important thing to hone in on is what is the actual image coming out of it. And some of these reviews don't even really have images. They're just talking about charts. And get off your high horse saying that a camera is definitely better because it hits one check mark on a spec sheet. It's about the mojo, guys. Come on, there's more to this than just specs. There's something happening magical in your camera. You got to find it. It's your buddy. All right, take care, guys. Peace.
Movie Voice.